evidence is going to show that when he had to act, he did nothing more than hold Mr. Acevedo down until help could arrive. What he did not know, what Mr. Mattioli did not know on the morning of April 19th, was what medical baggage Mr. Acevedo carried with him into that house the night before and in that morning. Evidence will show he had a severely compromised respiratory system, chronically asthmatic lungs, exacerbated by an immunoglobulin deficiency. Another thing Mr. Mattioli did not know was that Mr. Acevedo was up most of the night doing cocaine, hiding that behind Mr. Mattioli's back. He did not know that, in essence, Mr. Acevedo was a ticking medical time bomb that morning. The tragedy ensued, and here we are today. So, Mr. Acevedo's death was tragic, but it was not a crime. It was, as Mr. Tiffin noted, an accident. Now, Mike Mattioli joined the Milwaukee Police Department just out of high school as a police aide for 3 years, then went to the academy, also enrolled in the Army National Guard. He has a heart of service for his community and his country. After he finished basic training, shortly after the police academy, he came back and began his career as an MPD officer. Worked at District 7 on the northwest side of Milwaukee, and worked his way up to special assignments and ultimately up to the Special Investigations Division just over here down the street, downtown. Because he had that assignment downtown, he had the ability to work overtime at private places, like go to a baseball game at Miller Park, American Family Field, I guess we'll call it. Or Summerfest, you might see uniformed police officers walking around. That's what those guys and gals are doing. They're working overtime. Mr. Mattioli did some of that work at Northwestern Mutual Life, new office tower just up on Mason Street. And that's where he met Joel Acevedo, who was working as a security guard there. They met in late 2019. And evidence will show they became friends through that work relationship. And in March, they got together with Mr. Mattioli's friends, Christopher Peters and Andrew Janowski, and they all met there for the first time, a pub crawl before St. Patrick's Day called the Shamrock Shuffle. Had a great time. Everybody got along fine. And you'll remember, I'm quite sure, that about a week or two after that, the coronavirus came around, and we all learned what that was. Stay-at-home orders, lockdowns, things like that. And so they didn't have much contact for the next month. So April 18th comes around, and Mr. Mattioli reaches out to his friends and says, why don't we get together at my house, sit out in the backyard with the bonfire, have some drinks. And these same four guys get together there. And everything is fine. Everyone's getting along great. They have a good time at the bonfire, have some drinks, smoke some cigars. It's a fine night. No issues. Unbeknownst to Mr. Mattioli, however, Mr. Peters and Mr. Acevedo are using cocaine throughout the night covertly behind Mr. Mattioli's back because they know he would not be happy as a police officer about friends of his using illegal drugs in his house. So Mike doesn't know that's going on. But otherwise, the night is going fine. Everyone's having a good time, and people start to peel off to bed, though no one really knows about what time everybody went to sleep. Mr. Mattioli goes upstairs to his bedroom, just lays down on the bed, on top of the sheets, wearing his clothes he was wearing, didn't get into his pajamas, straight down. Mr. Janowski makes his way to the living room couch, goes to sleep there. Mr. Peters in the basement, as Mr. Tiffin sort of mentioned. No one really knows whether or if or where Mr. Acevedo went to sleep that night. But the next thing the evidence will show is that sometime after 7 in the morning, Mr. Mattioli feels a hand in his pants pocket as he's sleeping on his back, and he kind of, comes to in the late night, early morning, and he sees Mr. Acevedo standing on the side of his bed with his hand in Mr. Mattioli's pockets. He sits up, and evidence will show Mr. Acevedo kind of took a step back. Mr. Mattioli said, "What are you doing?" And there was really no response. And Mr. Mattioli said, "Were you stealing from me?" or something along those lines. And then Mr. Acevedo became upset. And with your testimony about how the discussion was, "I'm not stealing from you, I wasn't doing that," and Mr. Acevedo starts emptying his pockets onto Mr. Mattioli's bed as if to say, "Look here, I don't have any of your stuff." There's a hairbrush he throws out, a lighter, Kleenex. and a couple bucks. One of those dollar bills, the evidence will show, is a rolled up single with cocaine residue on it and the DNA of Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Peters. And so now, of course, Mr. Mattioli does not know that has been going on even at this time. He's telling Mr. Acevedo, it's time for you to leave my house, get out of my house. You'll hear evidence that there was some protestations about that. Mr. Acevedo felt like he hadn't done anything wrong, didn't want to go, but he heads downstairs into the living room, where those stairs empty out into Mr. Mattioli walking behind him. Mr. Janowski is sleeping right there on the couch. The evidence will show that as they get down into that area, again, the argument's continuing, leave the house, and some curse words are yelled back and forth. I'm not going to leave, I did nothing wrong. Mr. Janowski gets up to the motion and says, what's going on? And at this point, the evidence will be that Mr. Acevedo is sort of turned and is facing Mr. Mattioli, and Mr. Peters comes up from the basement as well because he hears the same motion going on. Mr. Acevedo will sort of strike out at Mr. Mattioli and sort of push him in the upper chest and just knock him back a little bit. Not a big deal, really. Not a vicious punch. But then he turned to Mr. Peters and did deliver a vicious punch to Mr. Peters, splitting his eye below his eye and knocking him sprawling onto the floor. And at that moment, Mr. Acevedo also falls down because of the punch. He really lost his balance. Now he's on the ground. Now the situation is very different. We're not just an argument about were you stealing from me or not, you got to go. Now we've got an assault that's taking place in Mr. Mattioli's home by someone who's refusing to leave his home. So Mr. Mattioli now tries to get on top of Mr. Acevedo to stop any further violence from occurring, to protect Mr. Peters, to protect himself, and to get Mr. Acevedo under control. Because now the evidence will be Mr. Mattioli wants the police to come. He wants Mr. Acevedo arrested for what he's just done. And Mr. Acevedo is not a small man. Neither is Mr. Mattioli, but Mr. Acevedo is bigger than Mr. Mattioli. And it's not easy. And so Mr. Acevedo is able to get up, and Mike's able to get him back down. And this happens up and down, and happens as they work their way from the living room into the small little kitchen, where there's a kitchen table in there, not much room to maneuver at all. And the struggle is ongoing. Two big guys trying to, struggle, wrestle, basically, as Mr. Mattioli is trying to get Mr. Acevedo under control. At some point, the evidence will be that Mr. Acevedo seemed to calm down. Mr. Mattioli took that opportunity to stand up, still while standing over Mr. Acevedo, pull out his phone and call 911. You'll get to hear that call, and you'll hear, at least initially, you'll hear some yelling in the background. It can be hard to make out what people are saying. You'll hear Mr. Acevedo's voice. You'll hear it for yourself. It sounds like he's saying, now I'll go home, or something like that, or he resisted previously. Mr. Mattioli is talking to the dispatcher. He's fairly calm at that moment. And he says, I'm an off-duty police officer, I need help at my house. Dispatcher asks a couple more questions, and there are no answers. Because as soon as Mr. Acevedo realized that Mr. Mattioli had in fact called 911, he started to struggle again. He did not want to go to jail. So Mr. Mattioli doesn't know what happens to the phone. He drops it. It's knocked out of his hand. I think evidence will be he's not sure. You will hear there's a period of time then where no one's answering the dispatcher's questions, and you can hear clear sounds of a struggle going on in the background. Yelling back and forth, people knocking into furniture. You hear a struggle, which you hear. And after a short period of time, another voice gets on the phone. You'll hear that's Christopher Peters, the guy who'd been punched. And he starts trying to answer the dispatcher's questions, and the evidence will be, you'll hear it, he says, there's a man here attacking us, says that a couple of times. And he's having a hard time answering some of the questions. He's clearly out of it. You'll kind of hear that on the tape, I believe. And at some point, he also says, please hurry. Please hurry. You'll hear Mr. Peters describe for you here in this courtroom about what was going on, why he wanted them to hurry. You'll hear Mr. Janowski testify. He'll tell you or describe, I believe, what he said was Mr. Acevedo fighting like crazy in that kitchen. And meanwhile, this struggle is still going on the way I've described before. It's up, it's down. Mr. Mattioli does not have control of this situation when 911's on the phone. But at some point, that call lasts about 3.5 minutes. That struggle is going on. Eventually, the dispatcher disconnects and says someone's on the road. Now, the struggle had continued, but people are starting to get tired. 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. It's a long time to be resting for two big guys to be fighting, getting up and down, wrestling. And at some point, Mr. Mattioli had been trying to get Mr. Acevedo's arms behind him to get him down. Mr. Acevedo's like on all fours. The evidence will show he couldn't do it because Mr. Acevedo's a strong dude, big guy. And eventually, Mr. Mattioli got a little higher on Mr. Acevedo's back and one last sort of shove with his chest to get him down onto the ground. And in that position is essentially where police find them when they come in several minutes later. Once it was under control, Mr. Mattioli held that position until help could arrive. Because Mr. Mattioli was focused on getting help there and getting Mr. Acevedo arrested and in custody. His focus was on getting him handcuffed. You will hear in the body cameras Mr. Tiffin referenced that when Officer Roach and Sheriff Mehta come into the house, first thing they hear from Mr. Mattioli is handcuff this guy. Handcuff this guy. And then Mr. Roach says, or Officer Roach, excuse me, says something about, he's still breathing, ain't he? And Mr. Mattioli's response is, again, I don't know, but handcuff him. Again, that's on his mind. Handcuff this man. When Mr. Mattioli gets up, you'll see he pulls Mr. Acevedo's right arm, which is out at his side. It wasn't being held behind his back. It was out at his side. He pulled Mr. Acevedo's right arm back as if to help the officers handcuff him, and they said, just get up and get out of here. You'll see all that. I think you'll also hear testimony that, Mr. Mattioli was asked to leave the kitchen. He did. And he sort of looked on before he left in utter disbelief when they rolled Mr. Acevedo over. He saw that he was unresponsive in the shape he was in. Couldn't believe what he was seeing. They had just been fighting minutes before. No indication to him that Mr. Acevedo was in distress, unable to breathe. When Mr. Mattioli goes outside with another officer named Buzek, and they have a brief conversation, and he tells Officer Buzek he'll be fine. And Buzek responds, like, they're doing chest compressions on him. Mr. Mattioli responds again, no, he'll be fine. That's what he thinks. The evidence will show that he didn't do anything. He didn't believe he had done anything to cause that harm. He was on Mr. Acevedo's back. Mr. Mattioli's knees were anchored to the ground. His arms were anchored on the ground. He was not laying with his entire body weight on Mr. Acevedo, a big guy. Mr. Acevedo was resuscitated, taken to the hospital. And I think you'll hear that, the officers involved say this is an off-duty cop, so now this is a big deal. More and more officers start to come. The bosses get called. There's command posts that come and are set up on Cleveland Avenue outside of Mr. Mattioli's house after he's been put in the back of a supervisor's squad car and just told to sit. And he sees all this unfolding. In his mind, from that morning, he wakes up to someone trying to steal from him. He wakes up trying to get that person out of his house. That person assaults his friend. He calls 911. And he can understand why he's the one sitting in the back of the squad car. For 5 hours, the evidence will show he sat there for 5 hours with nobody telling him what was happening. Sees the command staff show up and he's not getting answers to why he's still sitting there. And his frustration starts. Boy, Detective Dallin here is an investigator with the Milwaukee County DA's office. They get involved because it's an MPD off-duty officer, and so they want to try and avoid any appearance of conflict, so they bring in the DA's office. Investigator Dallin sits in the car and tries to introduce himself, and he's met with an angry response from Mr. Mattioli, who I think the evidence will show that not his finest moment or one he's proud of in the way that he spoke to Investigator Dallin. But he was frustrated and didn't understand what was happening because the evidence will show he did not believe Mr. Acevedo could be in that bad. He tells the officers that, Detective Dallin, that as the afternoon proceeds and Mr. Mattioli is taken to the DA's office where he's formally arrested about 3 or 4 hours after that. And then he's read his Miranda rights and he says, yeah, here's what happened. He tells Investigator Dallin what happened. Just a way of recounting it to you, you'll hear it in this court. He tells Investigator Dallin as well that, yes, I had my arm around his neck in that position, but I wasn't squeezing him, I wasn't choking. Something he repeatedly said. And something as Mr. Tiffins just referenced to you, medical examiners ultimately confirmed. Evidence will show there's no damage to his neck. There's no medical evidence of compression of Mr. Acevedo's neck. None. And so I would disagree with Mr. Tiffin about one thing. It's not only Mr. Acevedo who would know what happened in terms of whether the neck was squeezed. Mr. Mattioli knows, and he knows he didn't. He told officers he didn't. And so we're left with the situation, Mr. Mattioli's left with the situation where he hasn't brought this man's airways attention. He's just holding this man down, trying to wait for police. And about a year goes by after the autopsy, and we get access to Mr. Acevedo's historical medical records. You're going to hear evidence about those, why those are important in this case. Because they showed that Mr. Acevedo had a history of chronic asthma, as I said before, immunoglobulin deficiency, things that made him a higher risk for a bad outcome when it comes to respiratory issues. And the chain of events that got set in motion the morning of April 19th by Mr. Acevedo's own conduct were such that he was not a person whose body efficiently moved oxygen to begin with. These issues. Plus, he was a smoker. Plus, his obesity didn't help that issue either. And so, on a regular day, he's not in a great place with his breathing capabilities. Then you throw in the evidence will show this lengthy struggle and fight that elevates the heart rate, that requires the body to get more and more oxygen to the muscles, to the heart. And he's got cocaine on top of that. Again, quicker heart rate, needing more oxygen. And his body is not in good shape to produce it in the best of ways. And this was not the best of ways. And he's fighting, and he finally gets into a prone position that is his face down. Mr. Mattioli's on his back, holding him there for police. He's not resting all of his weight. But Mr. Acevedo's lungs are such that they can't handle that insult. Chest cavity is not able to move much because he's obese, in part because Mr. Mattioli's got some additional pressure on there. Mr. Mattioli's actions, the evidence will show, were reasonable. They were not the cause of Mr. Acevedo's death. Mr. Acevedo had other issues that contributed to his tragic outcome. You'll hear Dr. James Pearl, a pulmonologist, testify about those issues and describe for them to you what they meant and how they contributed to Mr. Acevedo's death. You'll hear from Dr. Jimmy Valentine, a toxicologist, who will describe for you toxicology results that ultimately came out of Mr. Acevedo's blood that showed the level of cocaine in the system and how it indicated a binge in the preceding hours before his death. You'll hear from Dr. Jeffrey Jensen, the retired medical examiner from Milwaukee County, who reviewed the autopsy and medical records in this case. And he'll tell you how, again, Mr. Acevedo's pre-existing conditions and substance abuse contributed to his death. The evidence will show this is a sad case, a tragic case. But it's not a crime. It was not a crime. It is not a crime. Mr. Mattioli acted reasonably in protecting himself and Mr. Peters from further violence. He acted reasonably holding Mr. Acevedo until police could get him. He's innocent. When the evidence is in, we'll ask you to find him not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the opening statements. And as I indicated earlier, we're not going to get into testimony today. So we have an early adjournment this morning or this afternoon. We'll start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So I'm going to ask everyone, you'll be meeting with the deputies as you exit today. And make sure, I believe the deputies already have collected your cell phone numbers. Just make sure if there's any reason you can't arrive, make sure you have the court clerk's phone number if you have any sort of emergency tomorrow. Now, I don't want to indicate that you are in any way excused from jury service. Now that you're on the jury, this is a mandatory appearance tomorrow. So we'll see you at 9 a.m. We'll follow roughly the same schedule we did today. We'll start around 9. We'll break for lunch at about noon, from noon to 1:30. And then I expect to be here from 1:30 to 5 tomorrow afternoon. Again, during lunch, you can go wherever you want. You can exit the building or stay here in the cafeteria downstairs. I do have to remind you again, though, you can't talk about the case. So until you get to deliberations, you have to hold all those thoughts and conversations you want to have for those deliberations. And we expect to get to that point probably on Thursday, based on what I've heard from the attorneys. But again, you can't talk with each other or anyone else about the case until you get to deliberations, when you can start talking with your fellow jurors. Now, does anyone have any questions before we break for the afternoon? Okay. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again. We'll see you in the morning at 9 a.m. All rise for jury. Thanks. Please take your seats. So parties, I expect to at least start testimony at 9 a.m. I was going to ask parties if you can be here at 8:45.
Sure.
Okay. Yes. All right. Were there any issues? Well, the parties, before I get to the parties, I have one issue I want to raise. Media folks, I did receive one alert. An individual watching the live stream said they did see one of the jurors. I believe it was juror number 23, who's seated in the very front corner here. So I'm just going to caution you to make sure your cameras do not pick up any corner or part of the jury box. Parties, anything else you want to address, Mr. Tiffin?
No.
Or Mr. Hart?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we'll see you all in the morning, 9 a.m. Court's adjourned.
Thank you.
Again, 8:45 for the parties.